Welcome to the Denison Forum Podcast. I'm Mark Turman, your host for today's conversation as we seek to equip you in our fourth year of podcasting on the Denison Forum Podcast. We want to equip you to think biblically, to live holy, and to serve eagerly in the places where God gives you an opportunity to not only know Him, but to walk with Him and serve Him. And we are grateful for you as our podcast audience and eager to serve you in great ways in the coming new year. And we hope to do that in a great way today with our special guest. Joining me for today's conversation, as he does from time to time, is Dr. Ryan Dennison, who is our senior editor for theology at Denison Forum. And we're joined today by a very prolific author and great thinker, our friend Ross Douthat, who you may be familiar with. He is a New York Times opinion columnist and has held that position since 2009. Prior to that, he was with The Atlantic as senior editor. He is also the author of a number of books, including The Deep Places, The Decadent Society, To Change the Church, Bad Religion, and today we are talking with him about his latest work called Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. You may also encounter him as the film critic at National Review, and he would also let you know that he is married, has 5 children, and they make their home in New Haven, Connecticut. So, Ross, welcome to the Denison Forum Podcast. We're glad to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I don't know if I would let everyone know that. It's more like, the 5 children sort of handle the letting everyone know part of that.
Right. Yeah, I heard my favorite comedian say recently after his 5th child was born, he said it's like treading water and about to drown, and then somebody hands you a baby. That's what it's like having 5 children. So, my mother had 8 kids, so I can imagine what challenges it holds.
Well,
right?
At eight, you just start handing them off to the older children, though, right?
Exactly.
The challenge at 5 is that the oldest child is, still debatable whether they're a competent adult ready to receive a baby. But I'm told that beyond 5, it's just much easier. That 10 is easier than 5 for that reason. But I don't think we're going to find out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I had 3 sets of parents at least.
That's right.
Growing up for sure. But, we are really super excited to have you with us. We are fans of your work and have followed it for a number of years. And you've helped us to understand faith and to understand the world in a better way. And we're grateful for that. And we hope that this conversation, both Ryan and I, have had a chance to read a preview version of your book, and we're really impressed by that, really helped by that, really stretched by that in some ways. And so we'll get into that a little bit. And as we often do on this podcast, if we go down rabbit trails and just take off in other directions, that'll be even the better. So I'll try to keep us on track and see if we can be helpful to our audience. But give us a little bit of the backstory about what this book is about. The title is pretty revelatory in and of itself, but give us a kind of a thumbnail overview of the book and what the backstory is that inspired you to write it. Who's it for? Those kinds of things.
Sure. So, as the title suggests, this is a book about why people should be religious. I think there's sort of 2 related points that it takes off from, right? The first is that I think as a culture right now in the early 2020s, we're in a moment where, a kind of big wave of secularization has washed over Western and American life in the last 20 years or so. You've had the rise of the so-called nuns, people without religious affiliation, not Roman Catholic nuns. You have, in a way, the younger generation in American life right now is the least churched generation, arguably, in all of American history. So you have this sort of secularized landscape, but in that landscape, you have a lot of, I think, sort of renewed interest in religion among people who some of them maybe were influenced by the new atheists, by figures like Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens, right? And, had for a while had the idea that, if you just strip religious ideas out of society, everything will be sweet enlightenment and, science and peace and so on. And I think people have sort of abandoned that idea for pretty obvious reasons over the last 10 or 15 years. A world with weaker religion has not turned out to be a more peaceful world, a less polarized world, anything like that. Instead, if anything, the country's more bitterly divided. There's more, I think, existential unhappiness, depression, anxiety, a lot of different forces like that, especially among younger people. So there's a sense, I think, that, maybe secularization was something of a mistake. Maybe religion has more to offer. But I think there's a lot of people who have that impulse, and some of them just don't know where to start, right? Like these are not people who were, raised Christian, went to Sunday school and drifted away from the faith in their 20s, but just feel like, okay, I can just go back to church, right? These are people who were raised with no exposure to the Bible, to Christian teaching, to sort of a religious framework generally, right? So there's people like that, and then there are people who may have a little more familiarity with religion and religious arguments, but sort of take it as a given that to be religious is to sort of give up on reason, science, sort of a lot of modern ways of thinking about reality and the world, right? And so if they're drawn to religion, they tend to think of themselves as being drawn towards this kind of suspension of the intellect, this sense that like, okay, religion is good for society. Maybe it's good for me personally to believe in a God. And I just need to sort of try it, suspend my reasoning apparatus and see what happens. And I think you get a lot of books and arguments about religion that sort of give advice along those lines that say, look, religion is a practice, it's a relationship, it's a communal experience. Don't worry too much at first about whether it all makes sense. Just try it and see what happens. So this is a book written for people in both of those categories, I think. People who need sort of an introduction to why someone would be religious in the first place and what religion means, and also for people who think they want to be religious, but that it requires giving up on their reason. And so the book is, in a way, especially from a Christian perspective, trying to be incredibly basic. It's not C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. It's something even more basic than that. Like what is a religious perspective on the world? What is it that unites the major world religions that secular society doesn't have? But then along with that kind of basic introduction, it's trying to convince the reader that in fact, you don't have to suspend your reason or give up on your intellect or put aside your science textbook in order to become a religious person and to embrace a religious perspective on the world. In fact, there are a lot of ways in which both what we know about the world from scientific progress and also what we know about the world just from the experience of modern life make religion not just reasonable, but in certain ways more reasonable than ever. So that's sort of the argumentative part of the book, is trying to persuade people that there is, in a way, almost an intellectual obligation to be interested in religion, because the basic religious perspective on the world does a better job describing reality than a purely atheistic, naturalistic, materialist perspective.
And that was one of my favorite parts about, especially the introduction to the book, is where you laid that out and how you really kind of highlighted how, and I sense a lot of Christian apologetics have made a mistake by almost allowing us to be forced to try and prove our faith to be 100% true, when there's really not any other realm of existence where we rely on 100% certainty to believe something. The rational approach is if it's more likely than not, then that's the rational way to believe. And kind of to that end, one of the distinctions you make early on that I thought was really helpful was the difference between being religious and being spiritual. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how you see those differences playing out, and kind of why religious is maybe not necessarily preferable to spiritual, but why you were tackling the idea of religion versus spirituality.
Right. So that's first. I really appreciate the kind words. Obviously, I think on that point, one of the things that tends to happen when you have a society where people feel like they've moved beyond religion and religious institutions, feel like they can't go back or don't have any connection that would enable them to go back, but want some of the things that religion supplies, both a sense of sort of meaning and purpose, an understanding of cosmic order, but also just on the personal level, right? A kind of, an experience of the mystical, the numinous, the supernatural. You get this category that people, it's almost not almost, it is a cliche of American discourse, right? The idea that I'm spiritual but not religious, right? Which can mean all kinds of things, but in practice it might mean I believe in some higher power, but I'm not sure what that higher power is. I dabble in astrology and, bits and pieces of Western and Eastern mysticism, play around with tarot cards, say some Christian prayers, but also, burn some incense, and well, as a Catholic, not that there's anything unchristian about incense, perish the thought, but you know what I mean, right? That have a sort of like a potpourri, a kind of mix and match of spiritual practices without either a kind of dogmatic structure or a kind of institutional commitment. And I'm not sort of against that approach as a kind of starting place, again, for people who, I'm talking to people who have not had, from a Christian perspective, a personal experience of Jesus Christ. They have not had a kind of conversion moment, right? They're just sort of looking at the world and trying to figure out what they should do in it. And, to some degree, yes, in that environment, you have to do some kind of experimentation, right? It's by no means crazy to, read a bunch of different scriptures, try out a few different spiritual practices. All of that makes sense to some degree. But your goal in doing that should not be to make that your permanent default approach to, to sort of ultimate questions. The goal should be to find guidance and direction that leads you into some kind of institutional commitment and practice where your spiritual practices are embedded in something larger than your own creation. And, I offer a few reasons why this would be the case. The most basic is that you, the individual, are probably not a once in a generation religious genius, right? You are probably not graced with a unique revelation from God or the universe, right? You probably can stand to benefit and learn, as in other areas of human endeavor, from those who have gone before, from systems and structures that have been worked out collectively. It's really hard to do anything solo, purely individually, and there's no reason why an encounter with ultimate reality would be any different, right? It would be just as it would be very strange to say, I'm going to become a soccer player, but I will only play by myself in my backyard, kicking the ball against the house. I will never join a team.
Right.
It would be strange also to never seek out communal practices and shared practices that where you have people supporting you on your journey, where you have sort of obligations that you're expected to meet. Like, I know that I would be a much worse Christian if I didn't feel an obligation to get up and go to church on Sunday morning, right? And then finally, and I think this is particularly important in the kind of landscape we're in now, where there's so little institutional structure and so much experimentation. But, if you take religious possibilities and spiritual realities seriously, you have to take seriously the possibility that there's actual dangers out there, that the spiritual landscape, no less than the natural landscape, is not just a realm of sweetness and light where every being that you might encounter might have your perfect good in mind, right? And so I know people in my world who take psychedelic drugs, right? And who think that they're having encounters with spiritual realities by taking psychedelic drugs. And some of those encounters with spiritual reality seem very positive. People come away feeling almost converted to a religious perspective on existence. But sometimes they're quite negative. Sometimes people have encounters through taking these drugs that, from a Christian perspective, seem frankly demonic, right? And the structures of institutional religion, Christianity in particular, but other religions as well, all take for granted the idea that wandering in spiritual landscapes without a guide, without a map, without rules for thinking about what you might encounter is incredibly dangerous. And that if the soul exists, it's also important to conceive of it as something that can go astray and get lost. And that's something I think especially that does not come across in a lot of kind of warm bath, new age spirituality, right? A lot of the spiritual but not religious landscape just doesn't take seriously danger and the possibility of getting trapped or getting lost while being out there on your own.
Yeah, that's a great reminder, and as you said, one not often talked about, that the stakes are real here. As in other areas of life, whether it be science or either other aspects of materialism, that there are real dangers and real costs. And a life of endless experimentation does have real risk involved. But also, I wanted to go back to this idea of believing in religion as obligation. And let me kind of wander through here. There might end up being 2 or 3 questions in what I want to say. But this book talks a lot about some of the dangers, as you just mentioned, and drawbacks of disbelief. Tease out this idea that one of the threads I saw in the book is that it is better to believe something rather than to believe nothing. And then kind of matched up with that, you make a great argument. We at Denison Forum, we talk a lot about loving God with all of your mind. As Jesus said, love God with all your mind, all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And so we love that idea of approaching God not by turning your brain and your rational thinking off, but by engaging it fully in these questions of ultimate reality and the person of God and the purposes of God. So in this pursuit of believing in something rather than nothing, why do you argue that pursuing it rationally as opposed to a process of feeling or emotion or even practicality? Why is rationality perhaps the healthiest way to engage the journey of faith?
Well, I think you want to think of it as a kind of, it's a foundation, right? So Christianity in most of its forms has always said, look, there are things about God and about the universe and human destiny that we can only know through revelation, right? That you can't you cannot reason your way all the way to the doctrine of the Trinity. Before Jesus, was born in Bethlehem, you couldn't necessarily reason your way to the doctrine of the incarnation, right? And in a similar way, in the human relationship with God, you can't just think your way into that relationship, right? Divine grace enters in, right? Whatever you think about, wherever you fall on arguments about free will and how human beings cooperate with grace and so on, there's no question from a Christian perspective that you can't just sort of sit. You have to assume that God reaching down plays an essential role, and you can't get all the way through your intellect alone.
Right.
So those are both really important points. However, you don't want to leave out the concurrent reality that Christianity says that you can reason your way some of the distance, right? You can reason your way towards the reality that, and this is at least the argument in my book, right? That the universe appears to have been made by someone, does not appear to be random or accidental. It appears to be ordered by some kind of mind. Human beings, for various reasons, based on everything from, what we know about the fine-tuning of the physical laws of the universe to the fact that our consciousness is capable of not just apprehending reality, but understanding the universe and exploring it. All of that suggests that the universe was made for us in some sense. Now, I don't think you can say through reason alone it was made only for us, right? Maybe there are other sentient beings on some other planet for whom the universe was also made. You can't rule that out, right? But at the very least, you can say human beings, the universe was made for something. Human beings play an important role in what that something is. And then through religious and mystical experience, we get intimations of and encounters with realities higher than our own. That's sort of the three-part argument I make of things, things that without revelation and without, the inflow of divine grace, you can still get that far, right? You can say, we're here for a reason. Something, God, creator God, maybe a pantheistic God, there are different arguments there, but some higher being is responsible for our fate. And there's evidence that the higher being or beings want to communicate with us. To me, that is enough to create an obligation to be interested in religion and to try and have a religious attitude and approach toward the world, especially when you consider the further fact that we're all going to die. And if there is an ultimate reality that wants something from us and holds us to account, we're going to encounter that reality, whether we want to or not, right? So that, and now that, again, from a Christian perspective, that argument is insufficient, right? Again, it is a kind of, it is less than mere Christianity. It is just mere religion. But I think having that attitude as your foundation is important, even if you then, feel that you've advanced beyond it into grace and revelation, into the realm of overt Christian belief. Because if you don't have the foundation, then your higher level of belief, your commitment to Christianity itself, is going to be weaker and more vulnerable than it otherwise ought to be, right? And this is, I think, sometimes the downside of telling people, well, you need to just have an experience of faith and experience of God and not worry about the reasoning part, the rational part, right? Because yes, those experiences are available. God makes those experiences available and they can lead to real conversion, but they can also lead to sort of, temporary conversion followed by disillusionment. And I think that's much more likely to happen if you think of religion as something that's separate from your basic obligations as a reasonable person in the world. Whereas if you think of the experience of grace and conversion as something that builds on this basic foundation, then the experience of conversion and grace is more likely to stick and more likely to be permanently transformative, I think.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah.
Thank you. Ross, one of the things you talk about in the book is how there's almost a reluctance at times with people coming back to the idea of religion. And I was curious, to what extent do you think a basic recognition that your current worldview is flawed is kind of a necessary starting place for beginning that journey?
I mean, I think it depends on the individual, but it also, I think American culture right now contains different groups, right? I think if you go out a little bit from the world that I'm in a lot of the time, which you might call, the world of the intelligentsia, I think you find a lot of people who just have a kind of open-ended worldview, who think there might be a God, universe might have a purpose. I'm not sure what it is, and I'm open to different ideas. And for those people, I think it's less about deciding that your worldview is wrong and more about sort of accepting that you should have a worldview, right? That you should have a practice, an institution. And this is why I spend that time that I just, spent talking about, moving from the movement from being spiritual but not religious to being religious doesn't necessarily have to feel like a rejection of your worldview. It can feel like the fulfillment of the the sort of vague and sketched out worldview that you had already. That is different, however, from the perspective of, just to take the example of where I live, the average, member of the Yale Law School faculty, right? The average member of the Yale Law School faculty does not believe in God, I think it's fair to say, and regards not believing in God as a kind of constituent part of what it means to be an educated person. And again, I think the number of people for whom that's true is not actually that large. I think most people who are quote unquote secular have not read, Richard Dawkins and flung it down and said, that's it. I'm done with God. He's not real, right? No, most people who have secularized have drifted away from religious practice in a way that is not an intellectual commitment. But yeah, among the kind of the most educated, most credentialed Americans, there is this default and this idea that to be a serious person, to be that like the price of intellectual seriousness is disbelief. And that's a very powerful idea. And it is one, I think, that puts a limit on the kind of ground that religion can regain sometimes, right? That American life, Western life, it moves in cycles. You have periods of secularization, and then you have periods of renewed belief. That's been part of the pattern in American life for a long time. And we're in, I think, again, a kind of period of renewed interest in religion right now. But you definitely see patterns where, among intellectuals especially, the swing back to religion often has some limit on it, where people will think to themselves, well, I can go back to an appreciation of religion. I can go back to a respect for the role religion plays in society. I can go back to a sense of the usefulness of some kind of belief in God. But I'm not going to go all the way to Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead, right? Mm. And I do think that religious believers need to push against that attitude, right? And actually try and pull people further, pull people who have a kind of, a kind of belief in belief, but also a limit imposed by their kind of class identification, right? On that belief, a sense of like, well, I'm not the kind of person who really believes in a God of miracles, right? And that's something, I have a whole chapter in the book on the supernatural, right? And, the interesting thing about the book is that in certain ways, it's a kind of liberal book in the sense that I am offering encouragement to a lot of people on different religious paths, right? I'm saying, the really important thing is to make that initial decision to go out in search of God, right? And so I'm trying to give advice to people who might start out in, Buddhism or Hinduism rather than Christianity. So that's sort of the liberal side of the argument. But the more traditionalist side of my argument is that, miracles are probably real. The supernatural is probably real. Smart, educated people should accept that, should not rule that out a priori, right? And I think if you could get to that point, that would actually be a real change in American society that we haven't seen during this kind of ebb and flow, to get the intelligentsia to be open to the supernatural and the miraculous again. I don't know if it can happen, but that's part of the goal of my argument.
Well, I think in a lot of ways it was kind of a gradual path to rejection of that, and so maybe it will be something of a gradual path back. And I think there's a lot to say for starting that, for not being dogmatic about you have to start that path in one particular place, and just kind of trusting that God is capable of guiding people along a number of paths back to himself. And that if Christianity really does hold the ultimate truth like we claim it does, then we shouldn't be afraid of people beginning a path to truth that might start in places we wouldn't be comfortable with, and just kind of trust that God can still find them along that path. God can still lead them along that path. But also, I think it does a great job of speaking to the importance of just never reaching the point where you feel like you understand God so well that you don't need to continue that pursuit. And I think even within Christianity, I think there's a similar motivation, even if it plays out very differently. It's what you described with the intelligentsia. It's where we become so comfortable and so identified with a particular understanding of our faith that we begin to see that as the totality of who God is, and kind of close ourselves off to the idea that there's still more that God could teach us. And I was curious, that kind of as a follow-up to that, I was curious, like, what advice would you have for Christians who are trying to engage with this book, not just so we don't read this stuff and we don't read what you're writing and walk away thinking, yeah, if only everyone else could believe this, we'd be good. But in terms of applying those principles to our own relationship with God, is there any advice you would give us for that?
I mean, one piece of advice would be this reflects a little bit my own shifts over, my 25 odd years of adult life, right? Which is that, so I'm Roman Catholic. I became Roman Catholic along with my family as a teenager in my late teens, after a period when we had been evangelical and Pentecostalist. So we did a kind of tour of parts of American Christianity and ended up Catholic. And there was a phase in my life as a Catholic convert where my sense was like Catholicism was obviously the truest form of Christianity, right? This is what converts are supposed to think, right? It's obviously the truest form of Christianity. And I found it easier to understand how someone could be an atheist than how they could be a Protestant, right? That was like 24-year-old Ross had that sensibility. And I would say that, like, I think this is a reflection of maturity. Not everyone would agree with this, but I think it reflects maturity that now I would say I find it less easy to understand how people are atheists. I have less sort of respect for atheism as a choice and perspective than I did as a young man. And that I think comes through in this book. I think atheism is actually a quite it's much more intellectually weak a position than a lot of people think. But I have a lot more understanding of why people who are Christian disagree with one another, and why people, not just why Protestants are Protestants and evangelicals are evangelicals, why everyone isn't just, convinced of the perfect, the perfect truth of the Catholic faith, but even within Catholicism, in the endless civil wars that we have in the Catholic Church between liberals and conservatives. And I participate in those civil wars. I am a conservative Catholic. I've wrote a whole book critiquing Pope Francis, which is an absurd thing in a way to do as a, you're a Catholic convert, and then you're like, the Pope, he's really messing it up, guys, but I jokes aside, I stand by most of the arguments I made in that book. But part of making those arguments was recognizing, there are good reasons why Catholics disagree with one another. And not all, but many of the questions that divide Christians, divide Protestants and Catholics, divide Protestants from each other and Catholics from each other, are in fact, they create divisions because they are genuinely hard questions on which just, based on a kind of empirical theology alone, independent of personal experience and, revelation and grace and so on, reasonable people could disagree. And that's something that, again, also applies beyond Christianity to why Christians and Muslims disagree, or why Christians and Hindus disagree. And I think my perspective on those kind of disputes is that, in places where you have hundreds of years of persistent argumentation among people who share a basic disposition toward the world, either a basic religious disposition or some shared commitments to Jesus Christ as the Son of God who, died and rose again to save us. If these disagreements persist, you should have charity within those disagreements, and you should seek, without giving up your own commitments, that, like, there are right answers to these questions. This is I think the balance that's really hard to strike, right? Like, it's very easy to slide from I have respect for other religions to I think all religions must be equally true. I don't think all religions are equally true. I don't think all forms of Christianity are equally true. But I do think I have a better understanding than I did 20 years ago of why everyone doesn't just agree with me and where the lines of disagreement come from. And I think, trying to maintain that balance of sort of not just becoming a relativist, believing that, the questions have answers there's a right side and a wrong side to most important arguments. But also, what does St. Paul say, right? We see through a glass darkly, and until we see face to face, charity for people who see the same thing somewhat differently is really helpful and important, I think.
Yeah, that really, really helpful.
But no charity for atheists. Not. no. I'm just charity for atheists too.
Well, and sometimes, like you said, all of these questions, or a good many of these questions, are really hard questions, and that may be where some of the compassion for atheists and agnostics come in. And Ross, my story is both like and unlike your story. I grew up in a large, very highly dedicated Roman Catholic family that then drifted away from faith when I was about 10 years old, and then I ended up coming back into faith. Or coming into faith for the first time through a very conservative Protestant Baptist world. And I would have been in a place where I would have described my faith in my 20s as, well, I think I'm in the truest form of Christianity, and I can't understand why anybody would be Catholic still.
Right.
And how you'd probably be better off being atheist than being Catholic. And that you can imagine some of the interesting conversations that created for me and for some of my siblings.
At the holidays, yep.
Around the table, it could be a bit interesting at that point, because I just knew I'd come into the truest form of Christianity at that point, and tried to make that very clear to all of them, and they weren't necessarily in agreement.
They were so grateful.
Yeah, they were so grateful for me to be enlightened. But what really is helpful, especially in this conversation, and I hope that this really does motivate people to read this book. It's really helpful to hear you say, hey, this book is a step or two back from mere Christianity. Our founder, who you just met, so much of his story and our story is anchored in C.S. Lewis and anchored in mere Christianity. And to hear you describe this book, okay, let's step back a step or two back from that, because we're dealing with a generation that is emerging that doesn't even have a context to appreciate C.S. Lewis and mere Christianity. That's enormously helpful. But just what you and Ryan were talking about, I had this thought that my pastor used to say. He said, it's easier for God to direct a fanatic than it is for him to resurrect the dead. And so if somebody will simply take the initiative of saying, you know what, this matters, this whole line of thought and consideration and pursuit of the reality of God matters. And if it is, as we would say, real, it matters more than everything else. Which kind of leads me to what I want you to explain a little bit more. This moment in the book when I was reading it was kind of an epiphany, and also a wave of hope that really helped me. I think the simple phrase was, we need to understand the world is not a trick. Tell us what you mean by that. You've been already alluding to it, but tease that out a little bit further. When you're trying to say to these people, start down this road if you have no orientation at all, or you think that you just have to kind of blindly close your eyes and hold on and suspend your reason and it'll hopefully work out. Explain what you mean when you say it is not a trick.
Yeah, I think that idea, I come back to that a number of times in the book. And that idea starts with this, what I think is in a way, a strong, skeptical complaint made to religious believers, right? Which is that, if this thing is so important, right? If there is a God who made the world, didn't just make the world, made us, didn't just make us, wants us to do particular things, has a list of do's and don'ts, wants us to be in some kind of relationship with him. If all of that is real, then, shouldn't it be a little more obvious, right? Like this incredibly important thing, and yet, it's hidden from us. Why is it hidden from us? And there are religious arguments that sort of lean into the hiddenness, right? And some of those are powerful arguments, but I think it's useful to go the other way and say, it's not all that hidden, right? The universe, yes, it does not present to you every day in flaming letters, you must have a relationship with God the Father Almighty. If I look up at the sky right now, I don't see those words. But the universe provides a lot of strong indicators that direct you toward that possibility. And, and those indicators are, the familiar ones that religious believers have tended to invoke over the years, but they're familiar for a reason. The order and beauty and harmony of the world is a basic reality that points you in a particular direction. The nature of human experience, the nature of the self and consciousness is a particular reality that points you toward God. The possibility of mystical experience, whether it's the strongest kind, St. Paul knocked off his horse, or just the kind of more uncertain feelings of oneness and mystical encounter and so on that lots and lots of people have. And that if you don't have them, other people have them and can tell you about them, right? You can read about them in books that are available in bookstores, right? All of that is there pointing you in a particular direction. And so it's just not the case that, the world is this total mystery, this unfathomable mystery that we just have no idea how to react to. The reason that religions exist, the reason that religion is a central part of the human experience across cultures, across civilizations, the reason that the major world religions have tended to converge, not in all things, but on a certain set of ethics that are shared across major religions, certain perspectives on the world. There are overlaps between, sort of even the Hindu idea of Brahman and the Abrahamic conception of divinity. They're different, but they aren't completely different, right? Those overlaps exist for a reason. The resilience and persistence of religion, all of these things are, it's not that you can't argue against them, you can, but I think that they are adequate indicators that the world, you as a human being have not been plunged into some sort of trap from which you cannot possibly escape. And this relates to like questions about, if you decided to become religious, where would you go from there, right? Like, Richard Dawkins and others make much of the idea that if one religion is true, all the other religions are false, completely false, right? And so how are you possibly going to find that one religion, when 99.9% of all religions that have ever existed have been false? I don't think that's the right way to look at it at all, right? Like most religions, from a Christian perspective or any other, probably contain some elements of the truth. They may not contain the complete truth, but they contain elements of the truth. And by binding yourself to one of those traditions, you probably will get closer. You may not get all the way, but you'll probably get closer to where you're supposed to be than if you just sit still and do absolutely nothing at all. So the sort of Dawkins perspective is the world is a trick because it asks you to believe in God, but it gives you 100 gods and you can't possibly know which one is the real God. And I just don't think that's true to, the convergences between different religions. I don't think it's true to the role that religion plays in human culture. I think that the decision to enter sincerely into religious exploration in any time and place is just, I think we have good evidence that it will get you closer to where you're meant to go than throwing up your hands and despairing of this human situation.
It may surprise you to hear this, but Lent isn't for God. It's for you and me. Lent is a gift to us, a sacred invitation to slow down, look inward, and allow God to awaken our hearts to His presence, power, and purpose. This is why Denison Forum wants to put a special resource in your hands, one of our Lent devotional books. Which one? The choice is yours when you give a donation of $30 or more to keep this listener-supported podcast going strong. So visit supportdf.org today to give, and we'll say thanks by sending you your choice of devotionals. Choose from Awaken My Heart, To Follow in His Footsteps, The Week That Changed the World, or the Empowered ebook. Again, visit us at support.f.org to get your devotional book today. You can also find a link to give in the episode show notes. When you give, know that you'll keep this Denison Forum podcast going strong, helping you and others discern the news differently. So thank you for your generosity. We pray God uses the coming Lenten season to prepare your heart for Easter in a whole new way. God bless.
Yeah, so good. So good. Well, there's a ton of more questions I'd like to ask, but I'm going to defer to Ryan to ask another question or two. We could keep going for another hour, and our audience would not know what to do with us. So, Ryan, you had a question maybe about the influences of Darwin, Copernicus, or one of your other thoughts that you might want us to ask at this point.
Well, and a lot of what I like about what you're saying there is that I do think a lot of that, the flaws in the arguments from Dawkins and Hitchens is like they do almost presume that God should make himself abundantly clear to the point that there is no doubt about who he is, about his nature, or anything like that. And I think if you look at human nature, that as soon as we begin to think that we understand something, we kind of get bored and move on. And I think it would be, in a lot of ways, it would be counterproductive to a relationship with God if we ever reach the point where we did fully understand him, if that we're even capable. If we're even capable of that, which we're not. But I think one of the things we have to guard against is becoming so identified with our beliefs. And we touched on this a little earlier, that we begin to be so confident to the point of pride almost that we have it right to the exclusion of other people. And in the book, you talk about how one of the ways that Christians got into a bit of trouble in the late 1800s and early 1900s was with Darwinism. And then that echoed back to Copernicus, where the church or Christianity encountered ideas that challenged things we believed and got defensive in response. And I was curious if you saw any areas in Christianity today where we're maybe making a similar mistake, where there's challenges to the way Christians have traditionally believed, and we almost give credence to those by responding in defensiveness versus responding to the arguments on their merits.
Well, I think yes, although I think they're not cases always where I have my own sort of, clear best way that Christians should respond, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think, one of the biggest challenges for Christian witness in 21st century America is the sexual revolution, right? And everything associated with it. It's a new challenge. There isn't an equivalent in the 15th century or the 5th century AD. It's a challenge that's not about is there a God? What is the design of the universe, right? It's a much more personal sociological challenge, right? Of how do you live out a Christian sexual ethic in a society where, for various reasons, it doesn't seem to fit with the way that people live now. I am a theological and moral conservative who thinks that, broadly speaking, the attempts to just adapt Christian teaching to the sexual revolution have not gone well, right? So I would not look at that environment and say, oh, Christians are just too defensive. We just need to recognize that the Holy Spirit is doing something new, and we need to shift Christian teaching on, same-sex marriage, or in the case of my own Catholic Church, divorce, and so on. In fact, I think there's a lot of evidence that the post-sexual revolution culture is not headed to a good place and needs critique from Christians, needs a Christian alternative. But with all that being said, it is also the case that there is no Christian confession that can stand up and say, oh, we've figured this out, here's the exact right way to adapt to this new landscape and witness to and minister to people who are, not living in the world of 1940, right? People who come from broken homes and have divorced parents and, have gay friends or are attracted to the same sex themselves. Like there's no sort of simple blueprint for how you operationalize the traditional teachings that I believe in this landscape, right? So it's a somewhat different example from Copernicus and Darwin. I don't think that the sexual revolution, used a telescope to open some unfathomable new perspective on the world. It's more about sociology and economics and a lot of other, and technology, the birth control pill. But I do think it requires much more than a simple reiteration of Christian teaching on those issues. It requires sort of, again, experiment, exploration, and charity in how you deal with the complexities that this new landscape has opened up.
Yeah, lot to think about there, and something that's very important in our work and thinking as well. There's, again, so many more questions that both Ryan and I want to ask, Ross, but we're going to be respectful of your time. But we want to maybe land in a couple of places. If you included in this book some of the story of your own faith journey. Can you give us a word about that? Why you included it, and maybe a highlight or two in your journey of what's brought you to the place of faith that you're in now? And then maybe a bit of advice of, besides encouraging somebody to read the book, which we would all be in favor of, but where would you encourage someone to start if they encounter your book and they're like, okay, I'm going to get serious about this and I'm going to really pursue this? Where would you suggest that they start? Let's see if we can land on those two ideas.
Sure. I mean, in terms of my own personal journey, I've written about it in different ways a few times. It's an interesting case because I was a kind of childhood observer of my parents, and especially my mother's, much more intense religious pilgrimage and journey and exploration, right? So once we landed on Catholicism, I have remained Catholic since. My views on certain things have changed. I've, lived my life and had experiences and so on. But I haven't been on a sort of intense pilgrimage in my adult life. But in a way, I think that gives me an interesting perspective, because my parents were, again, in sort of charismatic and Pentecostalist circles. People were speaking in tongues, being slain in the Spirit. I was watching this as a 7-year-old, right, and as a child. And so in a way, I sort of developed this kind of like William Jamesian interest in the varieties of mystical experience from childhood, not having the experiences myself, believing them to be real or corresponding to spiritual realities, and just being interested in trying to sort of reason about them and treat them as a real part of the world that you need to fit into your world picture, right? And I think, I spend a certain amount of time talking about this in the book, but just generally, I don't think the secular and materialist world picture, in addition to its other failings, has adequately encountered and thought through what religious experience is, why it persists, and what it suggests about the nature of reality. So in that sense, that's something from my own childhood that's important to how I think about arguments about religion and irreligion today. In terms of further advice, I think it depends on, in a way, like which part of the argument is most interesting, and also like sort of what your immediate, what you are immediately looking for or feel like you're being impelled toward in religion, right? Which is going to vary for reasons you guys were, describing, just in, the difference between our respective experiences, right? I think there are people for whom I would say, like, if you're really interested in, the arguments about fine tuning, right, and the cosmos, right? These sort of areas where I think, science is actually pointing the way back toward religion. Then there's, books that I would recommend on that subject. Just, one I wrote about that just came out in the last year, a book by Spencer Clavin, that's about sort of ultimately how quantum theory and what quantum theory suggests about the role of the mind in the cosmos It's called Light of the Mind, Light of the World, right? Like that, if that's sort of your particular thing, if you're like, wow, I hadn't really thought about sort of the connection between modern science and ancient faith, right? You can follow some of the footnotes in my book to other arguments in that area. So that, but then there are also people for whom the best advice is, just to go to church, right? And this is in a way, this sort of brings me back to the very argument that I started out critiquing a little bit, right? The idea that, you don't need to have a rational foundation. You should just start going to church. And I'm saying, no, you should have a rational foundation. You should have confidence that going to church makes sense, but then you still have to do it. Right? Yep. Like you can read a book like mine and say, man, there probably is a God. And, religious arguments are really interesting, and just sort of stay with that for a while and never actually start doing it, like putting yourself in a position where you might actually encounter God. Or if you don't encounter God exactly, right, or it's still just like doing the thing that you think God wants you to do. So in that sense, sort of, if you don't have some definite conviction that this branch or that branch of Christianity is the one true church, you still probably have a church somewhere that you have some connection to through friends or your neighborhood or your family or your ancestry. And going there is as good a place to start as any.
Yeah. Great word. And we would absolutely here at the beginning of the year strongly encourage folks to do that. And as you said,
that's right.
Get
New
started.
Year. Yes.
Do something.
That's right.
Do
2025.
something. Yeah. And this is way more important than renewing your gym membership. So
that's right.
That's a good thing, but this is way beyond that in a big way. So we would encourage you. The book is Believe: Why Everyone Should Be Religious by Ross Douthat. And we hope you'll pick up a copy or grab the audio version, whatever format works for you, and that you'll pick it up and journey along with Ross in this conversation, and perhaps use this resource to pass on to others as well. Can be very, very helpful in that way. Ross, thank you for joining us. Ryan, thank you for helping us with our conversation today. And as we always say, we're very grateful for you, our audience, and we hope that you'll join us the next time on the Denison Forum Podcast. God bless you, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks so much, guys. It was a pleasure.